Welcome, dear students, to this new presentation. Now, this is on the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, which is prescribed in your syllabus, the first semester English course syllabus. So the presentation is titled Geoffrey Chaucer, the Medieval Modern Poet. Now that subtitle appears to have an oxymoron here, medieval and modern put together. But that is what happens with great artists, great writers, the Shakespeare's and Chaucer's. They belong to their age, and at the same time, they rise above their age. They transcend their age. And that is what happens with Chaucer too. And as the slides progress, we shall see how Geoffrey Chaucer is a representative of the medieval period of English poetry. And at the same time, he's at the threshold of the modern age. So let's go straight away to the slides. First, let's have an introduction to Chaucer. Now, as we have said, Chaucer is the greatest medieval and the first modern English poet. He represented the Middle Ages as a whole. That is, there were other poets we know like Langland and Gower especially, and Wycliffe was also there. Now, they represented one side of the medieval period, while Chaucer represented it as a whole. Now, Langland, you can say, represented the anger of the age, the discontent of the age. Gower, on the other hand, represented the fears of the people of the medieval society. Wycliffe, on the other hand, reflected the reform motive of the Middle Ages. But it was Chaucer to whom we always go back if we want to have a wholesome view of the medieval period. In addition to that, Chaucer's contribution to versification, stanza forms, etc., is also extraordinary, very significant. And he belongs to, as we know, he belongs to the period of great individual writers, that is 1350 to 1400. And among those great individual writers, the greatest, of course, is Geoffrey Chaucer himself. And in the linguistic field, too, Chaucer had made a great impact. It was his writings that actually fixed the Midland dialect as the standard English language in the medieval period. So we can say safely that Chaucer is of his age and yet of all ages. Next, the context of his poetry, the literary and social landscape of Chaucer's poetry, the influences, the traditions that contribute towards the making of Chaucer. Now, the literary traditions include, we know he was influenced by the Greek and Roman poets like Ovid, Virgil, and Boethius. Italian poets like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio are reflected. Their influences are reflected in his work. And then the French courtly poets, of course, especially Marie de France. All these traditions actually blend in Chaucer's poetry. And about the social influence, yes, the whole of the Middle Ages actually had a bearing on Chaucer's poetry. The 14th century social discontent, religious reforms, rise of the middle class, all this we can find in Chaucer's poetry. And though he represented the social discontent and the protest of the Middle Ages, yet Chaucer was never angry or bitter. His attitude was that of amusement. He presented the peasants' revolt, for example, in the Nun's Priesthood, in a mocking tone. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, Chaucer's Poetic Career, the periods. Now, it is customary to divide Chaucer's poetic career into three phases, actually, depending on the dominant influence. The first phase is, of course, the French period, where we see the influence of French literature, which comes to him through, of course, his association with the court. And the famous work that belongs to this period of Chaucer's poetic career is the Romance of the Rose. Then comes the Italian period, and Chaucer's diplomatic visits to Italy brought him into close proximity with the Italian poets. And so in this period, we see more and more the Italian influences. And the famous poem that belongs to this period is Troilus and Procede. Finally comes the English period, where Chaucer, of course, has the influences. He blends the influences, but he comes of age. His originality is seen here. That is the English period. And to this period belongs the great poem, The Canterbury Tales. Now, when I divide the poetic career of Chaucer, it doesn't mean that these periods are exclusive. No, they are not. Now, all these influences, French, Italian, English influences, can be seen in the all his poems. We cannot divide them into periods, but the point here is in each phase we see a dominant influence. In the first phase of his poetic career, the dominant influence was of French literature. In the second period, the dominant influence was of Italian literature. That doesn't mean there was no French influence now. There was, but the Italian influence was predominant. Then comes the final English phase, where all these influences converge, and the English his creativity now is dominant. The characteristics of Chaucer as a poet. What are the highlights? When I go to Chaucer, when I read Chaucer, what are the aspects that strike us? First of all, Chaucer is a great storyteller. His narrative skill is something we should always take note of. Then Chaucer's descriptive power, description of nature, description of people, description of situations. In it, Chaucer is a master. Then he is a powerful observer. His skill in observing details, minute details of human beings and of situations and events. Chaucer's humor, a strong point of his poetry, humor. Satire and humor are very much integral to his poetry. And his humor is said to be 1/4 cynical, 3/4 kindly. Then Chaucer's characterization is also a noteworthy point. It is said Chaucer has a double vision. He sees his character as an individual and also as a type. And that gives them their rounded character. Now, for example, in the contemporary tales, you have the knight. The knight is a typical character in that he represents the knightly qualities, but at the same time, he's not without his idiosyncrasies or his mannerisms, his peculiar qualities. So these typical and individual qualities blend to make the knight and other characters lively and fresh and rounded. That's a great quality of Chaucer. Then, of course, Chaucer's metrical skill. The meters he imported, the adaptations he made, the stanza forms he invented. All these are important characteristics of Chaucer as a poet. About his versification, we have already said Chaucer made significant contribution towards English versification. He imported the decasyllabic couplet from France. The octosyllabic couplet was already there. Then his most significant contribution, of course, is the Chaucerian stanza. It's a 7-line stanza rhyming A, B, A, B, B, C, C. It's also called the Rhyme Royal, of course. It's famous as the Rhyme Royal because it was used by the Scottish King James in The King's Squire. So this is the Chaucer's contribution to English versification. Now coming to the themes of his poems. Love. Love is one of the dominant themes in Chaucer's poetry. Then comes the skill of narration, narrative art. The art of telling a tale is itself a theme in Chaucer's poetry. Then Chaucer's poetry caters to the social formations, the new middle class that is growing after the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. We see the growth of the middle class coming of the market economy, free laborers. All this is very much a theme of Chaucer's poetry. Then one important point about Chaucer's poetry is that women find a place and position and voice in Chaucer's poetry. So women is also a theme in Chaucer's poems. Then in Chaucer's poetry, we see a nostalgia for the past, a reminiscence of the age that was passing, the disintegration of feudalism, the age of romance and courtly love was slowly passing away. And that nostalgia is seen in his poetry. And then satire, yeah. So we said humor and satire. He satirized all classes for their failings, all classes of the society. Courtly love, though it was passing, courtly love, we find courtly love and chivalry, the knightly codes of conduct in Chaucer's poetry. Sometimes they are derided, of course. He has a mocking reference to them. The outdated feudal order, the feudal order was disintegrating after the twin blows of the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. And that outdated feudal order is also reflected in his poetry. Then the Beethian philosophy also is one of the themes of Chaucer's poetry. And then his satire exempts no one. The church, in fact, is examined and dissected, and also the aristocracy and the clergy are mocked at. So this humor and satire cover Chaucer's poetry. And these are some of the important themes of Chaucer's poetic works. Now coming to the genres. Now we said Chaucer is a medieval poet. He represents the medieval society. How does he do so? Of course, he represents in his poetry, we see the medieval society, no doubt about it. The social institutions, the social estates, everything we find in his poetry. But he also represents the Middle Ages in another way. He represents it from the literary point of view. All the genres that were popular in the medieval period are there in Chaucer's oeuvre. In Chaucer's collection of poetry, we see all the medieval genres. For example, some of them are: the Parliament of Owls is a dream vision, and then Troilus and Cressida is a tragic romance. The Canterbury Tales is an estate satire and also a frame tale. These are, mind you, all very popular genres of the medieval period, and they get reflected in Chaucer. Troilus and Cressida, again, it is also said about Troilus and Cressida that it would have been the first English novel if it were written in prose, and it's because of the psychological insights that we get in the work. Then the Romance of the Rose, of course, is an allegorical romance. The Knight's Tale is a courtly romance. The Nun's Priest's Tale, the famous Nun's Priest's Tale, is a beast fable, and the Wife of Bath's Tale in the Canterbury Tales is a folk tale. So all these are genres that, and more actually, these are some of the genres that Chaucer writes, and he represents almost all the medieval genres: dream vision, tragic romance, estate satire, frame tale, allegorical romance, courtly romance, beast fable, folk tale, and whatnot. So this is the poet who best represents the medieval literary scene. And yes, not only the literary scene, we are repeating here, in fact, he also represents the medieval world, the medieval society. He represents all classes of the medieval society. In fact, the four estates: the aristocracy, the clergy, and the peasants. And of course, the now new middle class. All these estates are represented in Chaucer's poetry. And the Canterbury Tales, for example, gives us some lasting impressions of the Middle Ages. The pilgrimage itself in the spring season, the pubs, storytelling. These are all medieval features that get reflected in the Canterbury Tales, and of course other poems of Chaucer as well. It is said the Canterbury Tales is the first page in English social history. So Chaucer represents the medieval age in two ways, actually. By first representing the medieval society, the people and social institutions, the ordinary lives of the people, the estates, etc. He also represents the medieval society by representing all the literary forms and types. So his poems are actually typical of the medieval literary scene. Of course, along with the typical qualities, his poetry has its own uniqueness. So that's how he represents the medieval world. So that a part of the title of our presentation, we titled the presentation as Chaucer, the medieval modern poet. So the medieval part of it is now well understood, why he is a medieval poet. Now let's go to the modern part of his poetry. In Chaucer's poetry, we find a modern note. So we said at the very beginning that he is a medieval modern poet. So he represents medieval poetry, no doubt, but he also is at the threshold of modern English poetry. That's the greatness of Chaucer. He is part of the age, and yet he looks forward to the coming age. Now, why is he the first modern poet? Why is he regarded the first modern English poet? These are the points. Now, of all the medieval poets, including Langland and Gower, it is Chaucer who is most familiar to us. We find him congenial. We can easily connect with him as far as the language is concerned, and also as far as the content is concerned. His humor, his satire, all these very well connect with us. Chaucer developed the art of literature beyond the medieval. That's his greatness. That's his legacy, actually. He was much ahead of its time. Now, he was influenced by Italian humanism, interest in this life, belief in the potentialities of the individual. these are all modern characteristics. The free secular spirit that we see in Chaucer's poetry, and the fact that he is not just mental, and this Renaissance spirit of not only humanity and also his humor, all this make him modern. And we see in his poetry he derides the romance, and there is a spirit of criticism in him. That spirit of criticism is what makes him modern. And also, of course, humanism is there. Then he has less childlike faith in the established order. The critical aspect of Chaucer's attitude to society, to institutions, make him modern. And in Chaucer, we see the meeting of various traditions. We have already seen French tradition, Italian tradition, English itself is there. Then Greek traditions. All these traditions mingle in Chaucer. They blend into a harmonious whole. And this syncretism is something that is modern. And of course, his metrical skill and great phraseology, striking phraseology, all these make him a modern poet. So we have seen how we can justify the title of our presentation, that Chaucer is a medieval modern poet. So it's the oxymoron is now well explained actually. He represents the medieval society, no doubt. He represents medieval literature, medieval society. At the same time, he also looks forward to the modern age. The germs of modern poetry are found in Chaucer's poetry in the Middle Ages itself. He is at the threshold of the modern age of English poetry. That's the greatness of Chaucer. He is of his age, and yet he belongs to all ages. He is of the medieval period, no doubt, but he transcends the medieval period to look beyond it. So he was far ahead of its time, and that's what is modern. That's what is contemporary. So that was the presentation on Chaucer. I hope this brief presentation will help you in understanding the greatness of Chaucer, contribution of Chaucer, and the development of English poetry as a whole in the Middle Ages. Thank you.